So, Christopher Satoor, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here because you've done some really great episodes, and I'm just happy to be a participant.
Yeah, man. It's going to be fun. We're going to be talking about the work of Schelling, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who is sort of a commonly understood historically as a midpoint in German idealism, mentored by Fichte, and holds a strange place in German idealism, which I think it seems with Schelling from my reading. You gave me some other key things to read and my own readings. Schelling falls into this camp, which is a very frustrating camp in philosophy, sort of an unconscious decision we often make of philosophers who are seen as after or before certain culminations, right? So like, oh, Fichte, he's just after Kant. Like, this happens a lot in German idealism as well. Like, right, Kant and Hegel are the big dogs, and then everyone else around them is often seen as secondary figures. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, but Schelling, I think, seems to be possibly the worst case of that, and often that means the philosophy gets relegated. But long story short, we're going to be discussing Schelling.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree with what you just said. And in Europe, he was studied much more than he is in North America. It's funny because in the 70s and 80s, there was Hegel studies, and of course, there were societies that would do conferences and publish on Kant. But there were only a couple translations into English. The first in 1936, and so there was not a lot known about Schelling. As you state, quite right, he was seen as a midway point, a preliminary figure to get to Hegel.
Yeah. So, yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and you seem to be a Schelling fanatic. So how did you, can you remember your first Schelling? Was it an immediate love?
Immediate? No, I actually didn't like him at first. He made me quite sick, actually. I read the Freedom Essay, and I didn't know what to think of it at the time. He was attacking one of my loves at the time, Spinoza, and I didn't know what to do with all this kind of poetic imagery in the text, like darkness, and light, gravity, and light, and Ungrund, and ground, and existence, and all of this talk. I've never seen anyone write philosophy like this. Now, Hegel it's a slug to go through when you're reading Hegel. But, Hegel has his logic, his encyclopedia, but here's this text by Schelling that, at first I had no idea what to do with. And even scholars today say that, it is one of those texts that every time you reread it, you learn something new about it. Mm-hmm. So I find that I get that with a lot of the texts by Schelling.
What was the turning point for you to sort of begin to? I don't know if you're a Schelling, you agree with him fully, but what was the turning point where you started to sympathize or enjoy his work more? So you're now, because I understand it right, you're now writing your PhD is on Schelling.
Yes,
so something must have changed.
Yes, so during my undergraduate, I was really, really interested in German idealism. So I was, taking classes on Kant and Fichte and Hegel, and really absorbed by Kant and Hegel, actually. And by the end of by my fourth year, I was interested in Nietzsche and, of course, Heidegger, and wanted to do work in Heidegger. But at this time, the Black Notebooks had just come out, and Heidegger was extremely controversial. And so I didn't really know what to do. I knew I couldn't just, it was hard. People were really, really staying at a distance with Heidegger. So I took this class on Gilles Deleuze, who I kind of can't stand right now, on film and cinema. Sorry, his cinema work. And I wrote my master's thesis on Deleuze. So I was kind of a French theorist. I was into French theory, sorry. So I became kind of obsessed with people like Deleuze and Badiou and Meillassoux and some others. And then I kind of got out of it, and there was a graduate class in my second year of my PhD in 2015, I think. And we were studying Kant, and it just felt like it being at home again, reading Kant and Hegel and Fichte. And it was this class that, but we read Schelling, and that was the turning point. So I was realizing that there was so much rich thought and so much interest. There was an interesting writing to his work. It's not like, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for saying this. It's not dense and kind of a slog to go through with Kant. Kant is brilliant to read, but he's got paragraphs that last for 3 pages.
Yeah, the paragraphs are 3 pages, and they're to do with one really specific element.
Absolutely, you got it. You nailed it. And then from there, I tried to read everything by him and read secondary sources, and I kind of got really obsessed with him. I got obsessed with his life. I got obsessed with meeting other Schellingians, so reaching out to Schellingians via social media and Facebook and other modes, and then from there, just kind of, I became just obsessed, totally obsessed. Maybe it's an unhealthy obsession.
I mean, just while it's still lingering there, before we go forward, why can't you stand Deleuze now? I've made a note to ask you because I'm always, what happened there?
I guess it's more Deleuzians than it is Deleuze, but I really, really loved his difference in repetition text, and I wrote my master's thesis on that. But in this text, in this work, there are he gives kind of 3 no-nos to philosophy, like you can't do this. And one of those are, Hegel's conception of the bad infinite, Leibniz, and encyclopedias. And what does he do in his late career? He gets closer to Hegel, writes an encyclopedia, Capitalist and Schizophrenia. I guess it's kind of encyclopedia, and writes a book on Leibniz. And it's a weird book on Leibniz. So I felt like that was a kind of reversion of his more metaphysical work. So, and just when it's like Heidegger, when you get into Deleuze, you speak Deleuzian, just like you speak Heideggerianese. So it's, when you hear people talking and they get into this, discussion with Deleuze, it's kind of like they're using the nomenclature, but I really found his ideas at some points a little toxic, like philosophy is the creation of concepts, that's it. And I really didn't like this idea. I like the idea that for me, I think philosophy is always about asking questions, and those questions leading to an answer for a specific problem. It was never meant to be this, plane of immanence and philosophy is this sieve that allows for, to stop the flow of chaos, aka journalism. And so it just, I don't know. I kind of slowly got out of it, but he's become such a huge figure. And even him, like during his lectures on A to Z, La Baisse idée, he states that one thing that would make him shudder is is a school of Deleuzians, and now there are multiple schools of Deleuze. So there you go.
Okay, that all makes sense. That all makes sense. So Schelling, you said you're interested in his life. Do you want to situate him biographically, what he was like as a figure? The times and his influences.
Sure, absolutely. So he was born in 1775 in Leonberg, Germany, which is about 30 kilometers, I think it's west of Stuttgart. He was born into a family that were not super wealthy, but they were very, very ingrained in the Protestant church. His father was a Hebrew scholar and a biblical scholar, and what was back then called an Oriental scholar, which is not a nice name now, but all that means was that he studied ancient languages, so Arabic, Hebrew, Sanskrit, and many of the kind of Middle Eastern languages and ancient languages. And his father Joseph Schelling was quite an academic, wrote a brilliant master's thesis on Leibniz and the monadology, and really inspired Frederick, or Fritz as they called him, to peruse his father's library, which was filled with the works of Homer and Aeschylus, and he gravitated to this. He later states that he had more in common with his elders than he did with his peers. So he is this kind of Wunderkind. So in German, he's kind of like a prodigy, child prodigy, that learns 6 languages by the age of 13. It's quite amazing, actually. He becomes obsessed with the classics, we could say, Plato, of course, and many of these other thinkers, Homer, Leibniz. So he's reading all of this at a very, very young age, speaking to his father. Now, his mother's family, so his mother's name was Gottloben Marie Kless. Her family were way high up in the Lutheran Church. Mm-hmm. So they were deacons, or they were bishops, or they were priests all the way up. And so, it was thought that Schelling would become a priest. And so he was sent to Latin school, and he was sent back a year early because his teachers stated they couldn't teach him anything else. And he waited, his father waited 1 year to put this young child, pretty much, into Tübingen, the seminary school. Mm-hmm. And now, this is the interesting thing, Schelling's father had a good rapport with Hodelin's family, actually. And so asked Hodelin to be a kind of chaperone for the young Schelling. And it was Hodelin that introduced Schelling to Hegel. Mm-hmm. And Schelling's father had asked the kind of headmaster if they could all room together. And they quickly, these 3 young men, Hodelin, Hegel, and Schelling, became immersed in discussing ideas, the new philosophy of Kant, and they became quickly, kind of enraptured with the fervor of the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille, and translating. Well, Schelling got into a lot of trouble for this. He translated the Marseillaise, the French national anthem, into German. The headmaster found out and, cornered the 3 boys and asked them, who was this? And once it was found out that Schelling had done this, he was almost kicked out of school. They would dance around some metaphysical tree, kind of singing Hen Kai Pan, which means the one and the all. So you can see it was something completely. They were completely enmeshed in this this world of freedom and philosophy. And quickly, all of them became really upset with the way that the university was built up. So the 5 years that they studied, so 3 years of it was strict philosophical study and 2 years of theology, they realized that the professors at the time, who were quite well known or well known for their craft, were dogmatists, were really trying to craft a kind of theological Kant, as opposed to his kind of agnosticism, on all of the students. And Schelling at the time, in 1793, was still writing on similar things that he would later talk about. So he was writing on the biblical fall, which is evident in the Freedom Essay, this idea of being independent, being in the ground, which is God's ground. So it's not totally God, but co-eternal. And so he's writing on this. He also becomes really taken up with Plato and Neoplatonism. So we don't know if he was fully immersed in Proclus, but we know he was very much interested in Plotinus. So he cites Plotinus multiple times. A colleague of mine, Naomi Fisher, who just released a really, really great book on the Schelling's mystical Platonism, has this brilliant thesis that Schelling was more interested in Proclus, because there wasn't this, for Plotinus, the body is, almost tainted, right? But for Proclus, the body is, in a sense, just passive. So there's a little difference between the two of them. So he's, publishing very, very young. At 19 years old is his first publication. I mean, at 19 years old, I don't even know what I was doing. I think I was listening to Nirvana or something. And as soon as he finishes his work, his school, he becomes a tutor for 2 young barons in Leipzig. And it is here where, at the time, if you weren't going to be a priest and you wanted to be a professor, you started off as a tutor. So he was tutoring students. And in this time, in 1796, there was this philosophy being, promoted by Killmeyer and Goethe and Schiller, and this kind of romantic element of philosophy about nature. And he really disliked the way that Newton had described the world through its laws, and the way that Cartesianism kind of mechanized nature, and nature couldn't just be this dead, inanimate, homogeneous object. It had to be more, and had to have its own spirit, had to have its own freedom. And so he starts, in Leipzig, he starts going to lectures to kind of get immersed in the science of the day. He becomes kind of obsessed with it. His brother Karl is a medical practitioner, and he gets Schelling into this, I guess you could say, kind of occult physician named John Brown, who has this weird idea about contraction and expansion. And these two forces are going to be in everything that Schelling writes. They're going to be in the Ages of the World, the contractive first principle that contracts inward, and then the kind of expansive movement of becoming. So all of this early work is already present in many of his first ideas. He becomes immensely popular. He writes his first book called The Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, and it's just well known everywhere. Goethe famously stated that he disliked it. It smelt foully Kantian, which is kind of true. It is a very Kantian text. But in it, he says things like, nature is visible spirit. Spirit is invisible nature. So he gives this kind of new philosophy without a dusting in Sick, without a thing in itself. We now have nature and mind kind of forming two sides of a coin. We're made of the same material as nature. However, we're in kind of different spatial locations. There's this kind of there's a kind of organic unity going on now between mind and nature. And so it's really quite impressive what he accomplishes at such a young age. And he's interested in magnetism and chemistry and many other works. But he writes this 1798 treatise after several dialogues with a philosopher that's been not remembered correctly, Eschmeyer, on the world soul, and he writes this brilliant treatise, Wonderweltseele, so on the world soul, where he talks about, gravity and light for the first time, these forces, gravity pushing down all organic carbon life, and light, this expansive force. And so these kind of poetic forces are already there in nature. Nature has this kind of infinite productivity. And this is what really blows away Goethe. So Schiller shows the 98 treatise to Goethe, and that's it. Goethe invites him to Jena, and then, everything kind of just, his stars have aligned, and he becomes one of the youngest professors, I think next to Nietzsche, to teach in Germany. So he's like 20, I think he's 23, 21. No, he's 23.
I think that's younger than Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche was, no. When Nietzsche was head of philology, I think he was 24,
Oh.
I think. But he probably would have been a professor before that. But still.
Yes, so he's 23, teaching in Jena. And now, of course, Jena is known for, the chair of philosophy was by Reinhold, and Reinhold popularized Kant, and after him, Fichte. So, I mean, it's a huge, huge, huge thing for him to be teaching there. 2 books under his belt. Now, his next 2 works, which I think are become extremely popular, he was lecturing at the time a lot on Naturphilosophy, so nature philosophy, and what he called transcendental philosophy. So he released these 2 books, year after year. So the first draft for a system of the philosophy of nature, and then the system of transcendental idealism. So there's these 2 books that kind of make him even more well known, and there's a lot of the romantic element there. And at this time, in like the 1800s, he's hanging around the Schlegel brothers and Novalis, and Schleiermacher's there, and of course Goethe's there, Schiller's there, Fichte's there, and they get together and they listen to Beethoven, and they're reading poetry, and they're discussing, and he becomes in love with August Wilhelm Schlegel's wife, and who actually wanted him to marry her youngest daughter, Augusta, but she actually passes away. And the passing away of Caroline Schlegel's daughter brings Schelling and Caroline closer. And so they have this kind of affair that becomes scandalous, and Dorothy Veit and many of the women that are leading the salons are kind of scandalized by this event. And so Schelling leaves Jena. It becomes a little, it's not just the affair and the death of Augusta, but it's also, Fichte had been dismissed in 1799 from Jena. He had famously stated that God was equivalent to the moral order, and this really upset a lot of some of the faculty and some of the parents of the students. And so there was nothing for him to do but, resign, and he goes off to Berlin. And some of the romantic circle goes to Berlin as well. So the Schlegels go there. Schleiermacher is, of course, there as well. Novalis dies in 1801. And so Schelling becomes this he's got these great works. He's lecturing on art and on university studies. He becomes really, really interested in trying to teach a kind of liberal arts education without the state, without priests getting involved. And so, for this, he's kind of, I say arrested, but really what happened was he was held for one night by the Bavarian authorities and fined for his kind of free thinking, his free way of teaching. So that's 1804. At this time, this is my favorite part of Schelling's life. He becomes deeply ingrained in a conversation with a Catholic philosopher who not a lot of people know, named Franz von Baader. And at the time, Baader was bringing back German figures like Meister Eckhart and Cusanus and Angelus Silesius, the famous kind of theosophical poet, and Neoplatonism, and really attracting a lot of people. In 1805, Schelling has a seance with von Baader and Maria von Baader. They start getting interested in the occult, in Swedenborg and many of these other thinkers. And it's Franz von Baader that really influences Schelling to rethink theosophy and taking these theosophical concepts and using them for philosophy. Now, I should just say one thing. I should kind of back up. That Schelling was already born in a very, in a kind of a speculative pietist background. And so he already grew up with figures like Friedrich Christoph Erdinger, who was a speculative pietist, who was one of the great readers of Jakob Böhme, who you've had a brilliant episode on. And so he had a lot of these ideas about speculative pietism and in his early years, but now he has someone kind of mentoring him on these ideas, and so he he writes to his father and says, can you send me all your Burma, send me all your Erdinger, and his father's kind of going, okay. So he starts rethinking philosophy and religion comes back in the fore. And I would say at this time, from around 1804 onward, he becomes immersed in a conversation with Christianity, revelation, and freedom. And his system of monism turns into he becomes kind of obsessed with trying to ontologize freedom. So he writes his last philosophical work in 1809. And he doesn't retire, but he kind of goes into he becomes kind of a hermit for a bit. Mm-hmm. He becomes depressed after his wife Caroline passes away. He moves to Stuttgart with his brother Karl. He stays there for a year, starts lecturing privately. He comes back after 1811 to Bavaria, and he gets this one position that he sticks with for the rest of his life. He becomes the vice president of the Bavarian Academy of the Sciences until Jacobi dies, and then he becomes the president. But there, he's helping get this society together. He's lecturing and tutoring Maximilian II. So this is why there's a statue in Munich with Schelling saying Germany's, great philosopher, Schelling, or Germany's first philosopher, sorry. And he stays there for, I would say, to 1839 until he gets this great invitation to come to Berlin, to stand as the chair of philosophy in Berlin, as the story goes, to stamp out the dragon seed of Hegelian pantheism. And so Schelling goes to Berlin and he teaches there until 1846. It becomes a spectacle. It becomes a huge event. But at the time, a lot of the young Hegelians were attending the lectures. So like Ruga was there, Burckhardt, Bakunin, Kierkegaard, and they had come to see one of these great figures of German idealism, and what would he give us? And instead, and they wanted this kind of radical political thought, and Schelling didn't give them that. He gave them a philosophy of mythology and a philosophy of revelation, and they really misjudged it. They really misjudged it in the sense that a lot of them, Kierkegaard lasted a year.
Mm-hmm.
The other figures kind of just got lost and just stopped going. He ended up he stopped doing the lectures because he could barely fill the room at certain points. And so I think he retired from teaching and worked on his positive and negative philosophy until I think 1852, and he dies in Bad Ragaz in Switzerland. He goes there actually to get these thermal pools. He thinks that if he lies in these kind of thermal pools, they'll kind of regenerate himself, reheat his the heating of his nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
And he dies at the age of 79.
Not a bad age.
I'm sorry about that. That was a huge.
No. It's good, but I think it's good because it shows one of the important factors here when it comes to the philosophy as well. And this is, as I understand it, one of the great difficulties with studying Schelling and also saying anything certain you could say about Schelling is that, as we can see from the life you've just given us there, not only do we have Platonism, Neoplatonism, Hegel, Hölderlin, every single figure who seems to be around at this time, along with, the mysticism of Burma, etc., progressing throughout life. This same form of intrigue and influence and change is also in his philosophy. So to sort of pinpoint him and then pinpoint his work seems to mirror his life, which is that it's a process that it was flowing and changing, and change was an absolutely fundamental part. And so to say if anything's, Schelling, what's the word? Schellingian?
Schellingian, yeah.
Schellingian. That's awkward. Schellingian, really, I guess I can't imagine there's an accepted definition of what is Schellingian.
One of my mentors, Sean J. McGrath. Now, he's never been my teacher, but just reading his books and having discussions with him in person and email, he said this really nice thing. He said, to be a Schellingian philosopher is, first of all, to be a philosopher of freedom.
Mm.
So, freedom from what? Freedom from Schelling. So find yourself through the work of Schelling, and don't just create Schellingianism, but create your own.
It reminds me of a certain French thinker we were talking about at the start, one Gilles Deleuze.
So he says that, so that's very inspiring.
Mm-hmm. So would you say freedom is a good place to begin? Because it seems even biographically and, biographically and philosophically, biographically with this dancing around the metaphysical tree, and then of course philosophically it seems freedom is a key aspect. And he seems pretty adventurous as a person. These investigations into seances and occult and this translation when he was young, a bit anarchic, but very free.
Yeah, actually, this is the funniest thing. A Russian source of mine, friend, had actually pulled up letters that Schelling went on 2 archaeological digs, one in 1818. This is insane. And 1832. So he goes on behalf of Maximilian II with an archaeologist named Johann Wagner, no relation to the musician, the composer. And he becomes obsessed with the ancient world. He thinks, mythology is the true history of nature. It's, you can see nature's forces, as Kronos eats his children, or, as as Persephone is dragged down into the underworld, you can see the force of nature going from winter to summer, etc. So, yes, so freedom, since from the very beginning, from his first works, of the eye, and him kind of trying to find a ground to philosophy or a form or foundation, he thinks that freedom is the alpha and the omega. Mm-hmm. And actually, he writes this brilliant manifesto, actually, with Hölderlin and Hegel, called, I always forget the title of this. Oh gosh. No. See, I have so many titles in my head. It's a kind of manifesto for German idealism. And in it, he talks about recreating a new kind of morality, a new mythology, a new poetry, without the shackles of the state. And they actually say that they want the state to shrink. They say, this idea of the state is too mechanical, and ideas are free. So, we need to get rid of the state. So, crazy, already anarchistic ideas already in the oldest systematic program of German idealism. That's what it's called. Sorry about that. I apologize. So he starts writing things like freedom is the alpha and the omega. And freedom is the one concept grounding humanity and our ideas. Heidegger says in his lectures on Schelling's freedom essay, it's really, really nice. He says that freedom is not just an action. Freedom is a property of Dasein. The freedom is ingrained as this property of being. So, Heidegger kind of grasps what Schelling means by freedom. So, do you want to go, how far do you want to go back? You want to start with the freedom essay?
How do you usually begin? I'm sure you've now, over time, have you found a kernel where you could say this is where, because it seems almost counterintuitive to try build as you said, a Schellingian system, but at the same time there has to be some coherence. So how do you balance that? Where do you begin to sort of balance that problem that one should free themselves via Schelling, but equally shouldn't construct too much on that journey?
Well, I read him. I read him kind of backwards. I started off with. Sorry, that was terrible English. I read the freedom essay, then the ages, and then went back to his earlier work. Because his earlier work, I didn't have enough background to jump into it. It's interesting. The American pragmatist Charles Sanders Peirce states that Schelling was the only true scientist of German idealism, because he's not afraid to put down a system and start something new. Mm-hmm. And actually later on, Schelling begins discussing the idea of an asystaton, so a philosophy without a system. So if you have a system, it's not an open system, it's closed. And so he wants everything to be completely free in that sense, that, you're working through all of these ideas and not to be tied to one system. He says that. He says, what's worse than having your own cane walk around with you, which is your system. So, always trying to build on that. So he's already completely different from Hegel. But just to talk about what freedom is here in this sense, he begins by kind of reconceptualizing nature, number one. Mm-hmm. Well, what does that mean? Well, he talks about nature as this kind of unconditioned, absolute mode of productivity, kind of like and it's really helpful thinking in this sense, and he uses this example, a kind of a bursting stream moving forward. Mm-hmm. So that's these unconditioned kind of mode of productivity, this kind of absolute becoming. And yet there's what we talked about before, right? There's the, I apologize for that
That's fine.
clock in the background. Can you hear it very well?
Not massively. It's strange. The only thing, the only thing I'd say, when it first happened, it brought up about 3 memories of. I haven't heard that type of alarm bell in about 25 years, and it was an old friend of mine had that exact one, and I
No
remember.
way.
Yeah, I remember annoying adults in the hallway when I was about 6 from that. So thanks for the reminder.
So there's this. I'm not ignoring that point.
That's right.
I'm just trying to move forward. But yeah, no, I'm sorry about that. I
No,
apologize.
it's completely fine.
It scars me too, actually. That sound. So there, he sees, nature producing these products,
Mhm.
these products that have the infinite spark or the infinite potentiality in the finite. These finite products become what he calls kind of rogue monads. They become actants. They have their own action. They have their own freedom. Nature has its own freedom. And he sees these forces that we talked about in the very, very beginning, that there's this process of inhibition or contraction and this process of expansion. And so when nature is not moving, it becomes at rest. There's this process of inhibition that forms these products. So I like to think of it like a tree or an evergreen, growing all the way up,
Mhm.
and then producing acorns, and then the acorns fall off. They fall off when the tree is no longer growing or it's no longer moving. It becomes at a point of rest and it falls. And what happens? The acorn has that genetic element, right? It has that genetic element from the tree now in the acorn. And as it drops, it becomes individuated, but it's still kind of connected. So a lot of this logic is going to continue on in his later work as well, too.
So this is interesting. I'll throw his name in because it's where I'm taking it from, and he uses the acorn metaphor, actually, specifically that metaphor. I mean, the mystic Gurdjieff uses that. So I want to throw this in because Schelling at this juncture seems optimistic. Gurdjieff uses that exact same metaphor, but he uses it for the inverse reason. He uses it for why most people aren't free, because he says, what happens to most acorns? They turn into mulch, right? Only one of however many million acorns that tree produces will become a tree. So I want to, in there is, that's my pessimistic reading immediately, is that within this process of inhibition and contraction, or I guess expansion and contraction, it for me at this juncture, it's a bit too open. Like this metaphor of the river is, I'm immediately thinking Schopenhauer, and that process is blind and we have no control. So this notion of freedom, which maybe it's my modern mind linking it up with choice, this seems still very optimistic for Schelling. So, I guess what's happening with categories of, blindness, of the blind will of Schopenhauer, for instance, or of being just taken into this process. What is our position amidst this new nature?
Yeah, so maybe the tree example, he doesn't use that example. Maybe it's a terrible example. With the stream, when the process of inhibition is, when this contraction is happening, inhibition is happening, he says that whirlpools are formed.
Mm-hmm.
So I like thinking of the body of water. So this body of water contains the same identity, in the sense H2O, wateriness, liquid. And yet on the surface, it's allowed to have an infinite amount of ripples, and ripples on it. And so you can already see, he is he's at the time immersed in Spinoza. So if it sounds kind of Spinozistic, then yes. He's also kind of monistic at this time. And so he's trying to show that there's a kind of infinite expression of this absolute mode of productivity. And these ripples, which are individuated, yet they contain the same, I don't want to say spark, but they contain the same infinite potentiality. So they're still made of water, but they're on the surface, bumping into other ripples endlessly, is how he sees nature. Now, to answer your question, what happens is there's this process called the Stufenfolge, the ascending series, which becomes his main work, or what he calls the potencies. And so he says that as these, and it's very Goethean, Goethe has this idea of the Urpflanze, the primordial germ. But for Schelling, there's this kind of prime matter that first arises as the first kind of potency, as the first step. And it's matter. At this time, he'll say things like he loves Lucretius because Lucretius' clinamen, the atoms swerve in a sense, almost allows for a kind of spontaneous freedom. Maybe not choice, but, So you can see this first prime matter, this kind of soup, I guess, as the first potency. The second potency is when they hardenize, become gases. And then he gives up examples from chemistry and galvanization and magnetism. And then finally, the third phase. So each phase, it's not supposed to be Hegel. So, a thesis, or I don't want to do that. There's a, one movement and then a second movement and they become a contradiction and then there's sublation. No, for him, all contradictions maintain their individuality. So there's prime matter. Prime matter then, is inhibiting itself. And from that inhibition, something kind of coalesces and forms. And then from there, we get these chemical and gaseous and maybe liquid products that emerge. And then finally, carbon-based life. And so he states something that really I think it makes people go, what? When carbon-based lives form for Schelling, nature becomes self-conscious through humanity. Since we are part of nature, right? Humanity is a part of nature. So we become these kind of conscious beings, from that primordial movement of matter, prime matter, all the way up to this now moment of consciousness. Now, later on, this is my favorite part of his philosophy. I think it's the most romantic out of all of them. He'll say things like this, and I know you have a question on this later, so it's good that we bring this up now. He'll invoke something he calls aesthetic intuition, this aesthetic sense. Now, what is aesthetic sense? He says it is that moment of genius that we get from being in nature, nature's unconscious powers working on us, or its unconscious forces on us. So you see a beautiful sunset, and you paint something, the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, or you're walking down the street and a song comes in your head and, the tone of music, right, makes you write a song or writes a poem. He sees this as like the unconscious affectivity of nature affecting us in a sense. So he really has this, he's really trying to show that nature is not this compartmentalized, homogeneous, dead, empty kind of space, that there's this emergent process going on. Maybe you can call it a proto-process theory, maybe. And how every product has its place. Every product is an actant. It is, acting within these processes. And then at the end, which is very Platonian, everything, kind of goes back to the unconditioned. So, when we live our lifespan, what happens? as products, we kind of go back into that absolute mode of productivity, right? Energy can never be destroyed. Um,
Mhm.
so this is his nature philosophy, and it inspires a lot of people. It's not so idealistic. It's kind of his most material phase.
I was going to say, I mean, that what you call the ascending series, this notion of prime matter. It's interesting that you know, this notion of rising up. It all seems actually quite chthonic, almost like he's inverted the great chain of being, right? Or I guess it wouldn't, for him, it wouldn't be the great chain of being, which is more Thomistic, but the inversion of any of the Neoplatonic chains of what do they call them? I mean, all of them add their own layers, so eventually you just end up with this constant addition and addition. But it seems like he's sort of inverting that and beginning from this almost like metaphorically the center of the earth, which seems a little bit heretical to invert that into matter, you know, prime matter instead of prime mover.
Yeah, no, I mean, I may get into trouble for saying this, but that's all right. I mean, there's no talk of God at this point.
Mhm.
You know, he even writes a poem in 1799 kind of mocking Schleiermacher about, you know, Schleiermacher's kind of romantic ideas of religiosity being thrown at the romantic circle. I mean, he doesn't have an idea of God until 1801. So 1801, let's say, when he kind of perfects this system through his idealism, through his objective idealism, which Hegel calls objective idea. He calls it objective idealism. His transcendental idealism, let's say. And there, when he writes this work, which is coming off from the nature philosophy. Now, I'll get back to that in a second. So for Schelling, so nature philosophy begins when we think of the object, nature, and move back to the subject.
Okay. Yep.
And transcendental idealism is when we start from the subject and move to nature. So they really form two halves of one whole.
Mhm.
And so for him, you know, transcendental philosophy and nature philosophy form his main system, his main work at the time. Now, this transcendental philosophy becomes his identity philosophy, or Identitätsphilosophie, which Hegel becomes extremely involved in. And Hegel actually kind of helps Schelling come up with the words of identity and difference. So he comes up with this idea that there's an identity of identity and difference. So, you know, this unconditioned productivity, as, you know, absolute identity is creating other smaller identities from it.
Mhm.
And then from there, we get these differences. We get material differences, quantitative difference. And, you know, Hegel likes this, you know, in his different shrift, he writes about these ideas, but then has a problem with it because he thinks that Schelling is a little too monistic, that they're, you know, that it sounds like this is just, you know, as he says, the night in which all cows turn black. It's just a completely homogenized system. There is no element of difference, even if there is quantitative difference. It's kind of one gigantic soup, which I disagree with, but this is Hegel's mode of attack. Really upsets Schelling, completely upsets him. He almost becomes alienated by it. And then, you know, they spend the rest of their teaching lives taking shots at each other, which is funny. Yeah, so, I mean, the main thing to hear is that he has this mode of freedom, he has this mode of nature, this kind of emergent kind of process philosophy, and then he has this system of idealism to talk about consciousness, and even with the idealism, there is that element of product. He says this really beautiful line. As you can tell, like that, I'm getting excited now. He says that when we think of ideas, what happens is that we add our own product. So our ideas become our own products. We add something creative to it, right? Like when I think of my pen, and I'm talking about my pen, I mean, you see it and I can't see it, but when the viewers or the listeners hear this out, there's that bloody clock again. They're going to think of their own pen and they add their own element to it as a product. So it becomes there's a really spontaneous, creative element to his system of idealism. He's actually the first person at this time to really think not a systematic theory of history, but he has these ideas of like 3 epochs, that follow the 3 potencies, right? Like fine matter, the gases forming, etc. So he sees these kind of moments in time aiding consciousness, which influences Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Now I'm rambling too much. I apologize.
Well, the question I guess I want to get to in a way, because it's the one that intrigues me, and I think you're gesturing towards it already there in this nature self split, our relationship to nature, the fact of the split. Why is there the split? And it's what I want to ask is about this problem of reason in terms of understanding reality. So you've already mentioned aesthetic intuition, which I guess is going to play a role, but are we as individuals, as subjects, amidst, not against this nature, or split off from this nature, but still completely within it, within this ascending series? Where does our ability to understand the world? What is that for Schelling? Because it isn't, if I'm understanding correctly from my reading, it isn't reason. Or you can say that is and it isn't, but not.
No. You're right. You're absolutely right. This is now the concept I'm going to bring up, which you said it perfectly. No, you're right about that. Schelling gets a lot of flack for, because he reworks intellectual intuition from Kant and Fichte, and it's maybe more in Fichte's case. And I mean, this is where he becomes known as a kind of mystic. People see intellectual intuition in the sense of like Meister Eckhart, the eye in which I see God is the eyes in which God sees me. There's this kind of, they see it in that sense. But really what intellectual intuition is, how we understand the world, essentially is this. Intellectual intuition is an intuitive sense that allows us, that in a sense can understand how the world is interrelated, right? So we can never really grasp the whole, but we can understand the interrelatedness of the world. And so this sense, this cognitive sense, allows us to grasp those interrelations. And this is why we have an understanding of some epochs of time, products that we allowed, this aesthetic intuition that allows for spontaneous creativity. So there is that moment, and there is that element there. Now, intellectual intuition is not like the Cartesian cogito. It's not like, innate ideas are, put in there by God, as the mark of God, as the mark of the infinite. It's not like that. It doesn't give us knowledge of, it doesn't give us knowledge of the infinite. It essentially allows us, or reads out, allows us to grasp these interrelatedness, these interrelations of the world, that, allow it to form, allow it to, to be concrete for us. Now he reworks that and it becomes reason later. And then it becomes this, kind of absolute mode of grasping everything, of understanding the absolute as well too. And he gets into trouble, and he keeps reworking a lot of this idea.
So he's so slippery.
I apologize.
No.
Being all over the place.
No, not at all. Well, I think Schelling appears at least to be all over the place in an orderly manner somehow.
Yes.
And so he's very slippery, and I'm trying to, the reason I'm bumbling around the next question is I don't want to force a singular thread onto Schelling if there isn't one, if you see what I mean, which is probably something he'd be against. So I guess maybe the way I'd phrase it in terms of, where we're up to in his philosophical progression so far is, how does the question change that he was seeking to answer, right? Like that's probably as close to a single thread as I could get with Schelling.
That's great. So we had talked about how nature, how this aesthetic intuition allows us, this unconscious power of nature to affect us, which means, at the end of this system of transcendental idealism, he basically states that philosophy becomes the organ for art. And so, this is the romantic Schelling, but then he kind of rethinks himself, like, do I really want to say that? Do I want to say that, art in a sense is the true power of knowledge, that that's it? Like philosophy is there to allow for art to take place. This is a huge, huge statement that a majority of the romantics would probably disagree with. So he rethinks that mode, and this is where that change happens, where he rethinks his idea of the aesthetic intuition, and he has these lectures on the philosophy of art. And he becomes more immersed in, I would say, I guess cosmological thinkers like Giordano Bruno. He writes a piece on Bruno, and in it, the two main talking heads in it are himself as Giordano Bruno and Lucian as Fichte, in order to discuss their disagreement. And for Fichte, this idea of even having a nature philosophy is problematic in the first place. And so this whole nature philosophy is a very tense situation for Fichte, and it causes their departure as friends later on. So he's rethinking these modes of how he can philosophize about intellectual intuition and reason. Reason becomes absolute reason in his Spinoza model. For Spinoza, it's thought and extension of aligning oneself with the intellectual love of God, and so he has this, this system in the identity philosophy, and the identity philosophy is simply saying that reality is this absolute mode of identity, or this absolute identity, and that we are, in a sense, that reason, or absolute reason, allows us to think through that identity. So he's doing something that he would disagree with before, that we somehow have access to absolute reason in this sense. So, of course, the accusation in the phenomenology of spirit, comes to the fore, and he is taken back. He's, in a sense, not very happy with this, with, being called a kind of saying that everything is being swallowed whole in his system. But those that are not, if you don't see the progression, as you noted, it does seem like he's just throwing everything, as you said, Schelling's a slippery character. And if you don't see these changes, you don't read these changes, then it doesn't make sense, or it seems like that. And so when he gets involved with von Baader and he starts rethinking theosophical concepts with philosophy, so philosophy and religion, he then starts thinking of the ground, this foundation of how we can talk about philosophy and system. What is system, right? And for him, system is going to be the universe, but about uncovering that universe.
That's very Heideggerian.
Oh, there you go. Well, maybe it's very Schellingian.
yeah, maybe Heidegger's very, yeah.
Does that help a little bit? Did I kind of?
Yeah, no. It does help. I'm more and more hesitant to, I've realized my bias with lines of questioning in interviews is usually to try find like how's the progression, does it move from A to B, and that's it's one specific way of thinking, but it's difficult without all the context to sort of jump around as Schelling did over a whole lifetime, right? To then go, well, now we have to jump like to here, and you don't exactly know why, but you did, which I'm now going to have to do, because you did mention the unconscious, and I feel like this is kind of historically important as an early example of the unconscious in general. But so what does Schelling mean by that?
So we've already talked about, nature being unconscious and yet affecting us, in the kind of artistic Schelling. But the later Schelling sees the unconscious as the past, as a past that's inaccessible, that's ungraspable. And yet the true mode of the philosopher is about revealing that unconscious past. Which is why if you read The Ages of the World or the Freedom Essay, there's always this, he starts off with a ground that is God's ground. So essentially, if you want to talk about the movements here, it's almost Kabbalah. It's the Zinzum, the contraction of this ground that's now the receptacle. But it's a receptacle that is, it's a ground that doesn't have reason. It's just longing and yearning and ego, unconscious, blind. And then when the logos gets added to it, it's all of a sudden, it forms into a will. It forms into a kind of solid grasping. But there's this beautiful line, there's this beautiful passage that Schelling is, gets from the Bible here. He cites Proverbs 8, verses 23 to 31, where the divine feminine, in a sense, the Godhead is unconscious. It's just kind of creating like the demiurge. And the conscious element of God is this divine feminine saying, when you created the heavens, I was there. When you created the waters and the animals and all of this, I was there. And so there's this kind of real tension between what is filling in the content of consciousness, what is doing this. For him, it later becomes the word, the kind of logos, reason.
Does he see I'll use the word intrusion, but it might be incorrect. Does he see the intrusion of the logos as a good thing or a bad thing?
He sees it as a good thing.
Okay.
He sees it as giving this dark ground, right? Which is, by the way, nature in God. It's nature again. Giving it this word, giving it, and the yearning element of the ground and the logos form a kind of will. But that ground, right, this darkness, this kind of unconscious blind drive will be in every being. It's a part of every being. It ripples into all beings. And so where evil has its own being because of egoity, because of this yearning. The minute that we put ourselves before others, that unconscious blind drive from the ground, from that moment of the past, right, is already in us. And if it kind of consumes us and takes the center of our being out, we become completely evil. Like he'll say, it takes over our character, our personality. So for him, freedom is the choice of picking the good over evil. What does that mean? It means recognizing that this world that we live in is a kingdom of ends, in the Kantian talk of seeing others as ends in themselves. And so, like, the reason why he calls it an unconscious blind drive, I actually have it tattooed on my arm, der nie aufgehende Rest. It becomes this irreducible remainder, this irreducible dark principle within us, in the ground, in nature. Now, for nature and unfortunately for animals, they remain unconscious. They don't have these principles of darkness and light. Of course, dark represents the unconscious, blind, driving egoity, and light represents ipseity or individuality. Very Burmean language here. And of course, this is coming right from Burma, actually. So he sees it in that sense, but he works on it. So there's the unconscious in that sense. And then there's the unconscious in the ages of the world, where God is this kind of, there is the eternal Father, right? Then there's the Godhead, which is unconscious and contractive, and it kind of creates an other by again shrouding itself inside itself and creating an other that becomes conscious and wants and it wants to attract being, and so a lot of Kabbalistic language, and he does this through Burma and of course Angelus Silesius. So there's multiple forms of what he says are unconscious, but I know that you've read the Freedom Essays, so I wanted to highlight that for you. Now, I know that you've also read Clara.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's another thing. Clara represents the same three potencies. Mm-hmm. There's the scientist as nature, as this, there's spirit or mind as the priest, and then what's the third element? What ties them all together? Is Clara. Clara is this personality that is a kind of a mediating factor for all of them. And then, of course, there's the spirit world. But so this process of three is always there, always in the background. But this language of the dark ground, of a personality, is really the main part for him, because the problem of evil becomes huge for him. He thinks that essentially that evil can't be a privation in the sense of Augustine, that evil can't just be some negative element. God can't be responsible for it in that sense. It's already kind of ingrained in us in the way of our formation in that dark ground. So it is God's ground, and yet at the same time, because there's the fall occurs, because we are individuated, we're independent, that independence has finite beings, right? And the longing for the infinite allows for that egoity to emerge, right? It's this yearning force. Zizek talks about it as a kind of a cycle of drives. This is why he likes Schelling. He sees the unconscious drives of egoity, already there. It's part of this kind of libidinal element that's in all matter.
Why does Schelling decide that the dark ground, as he calls it, is evil?
Well, okay, so it's all right. Okay, so let me maybe I wasn't. Maybe I said that and I shouldn't have said that. It's not necessarily evil, but it doesn't know anything other than that. It's just blind drive and empty craving and yearning.
Okay.
So, and this is where it becomes evil, because when that principle, darkness, becomes a center in our being, our ego, or the egoity in a sense, this, subordinates everything else. We only see ourselves. We're only obsessed with ourselves. We don't care about the world. We don't care about the other. We don't care about what's going on and around us. We're only consumed with ourselves. We're in that endless cycle of driving and desire. And you can see that this also inspires Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's idea of the will. So that's what evil is. So evil comes in that moment. So it's already present as darkness, as separation from God in the ground. It's that yearning element, yearning for understanding, yearning for reason, yearning to get back to the one. And also it wants to consume everything, to put itself above everything else. And we see this in human interaction with, we're selfish creatures. That's, sometimes. And this is what he's essentially saying. There is a primordial origin of evil here, a primordial origin that's already within, the I don't know, what would you want to call it? The center of this ground. So, and it's always there. And at the end of the essay, he says that the ground becomes a caput mortem. It's dissolved in order for spirit to rise, and he ends the essay with love. But the point is that even though the ground has dissolved, it's still a principle within us, just like in Burma. Mm-hmm. So there's that dark fire and that light fire, and there has to always be a dark fire there. Everything starts off in the dark for Burma, and the same thing with Schelling. So that darkness, which, by the way, needs the light. It's transfixed in the light, just like the day needs the night and the night needs the day. It's there, present, always dormant, always like an indivisible remnant. Sorry, I'm talking way too much.
No, it's okay. At this point, I'm wondering if Schelling influenced Ludwig Klages, because Klages basically takes that whole thing and then goes the complete opposite direction. That's why I asked. Yeah, so the brief mention would just be that Klages would say that spirit descends, his language descends like a wedge and splits the splits the body and soul apart. And so it's for him that what he would call eros, which seems very alike. This is very rough and ready, but it seems very like the dark matter of Schelling. He would say that spirit is the thing that we don't want, and we should go back and be in the dark matter. So that's why I was wondering, to what extent.
Can I read you something?
Sure.
So here is this. This is this part. Okay, so this is a beautiful one of my favorite passages from the Freedom Essay. For those of you that have the Sunni edition from 2006, it's on page 29 at the very bottom. And so he's describing this process of creation. And this is how he talks about it. He says, thus, we must imagine the original yearning as it directs itself to the understanding, though still not recognizing it. Just as we in our yearning seek out an unknown and nameless good, and as it moves, divining itself like a wave-wound whirling sea akin to Plato's matter, following dark, uncertain laws, it is incapable of constructing for itself anything enduring, and but corresponding to the yearning, which, as the still dark ground, is the first stirrings of divine existence. This is where he's talking about the logos coming now to the ground. An inner reflexive representation is generated in God himself, for which, since it can have no other object but God, God sees himself in an exact image of himself, and this representation is the first which God considered as absolute is realized. So he's talking about the element of, you can say, consciousness in God, but also the logos kind of unfolding in the dark ground, adding the light principle there. The darkness is now being transfixed into the light. And now there's a new principle enveloped now. Now there's a principle that allows for, expansion as opposed to just contraction. Sorry, I read way too much.
No, it's good. So this is a big question after that. Where do you see Schelling as philosophically sort of ending up? Do you feel he gets to a point? Is your impression that, I guess biographically speaking as well, that he still was working through something, or had he got to a philosophical point that he was quite ironically stable with?
I think that's a really great question. So he's flirting with theosophy here, for sure. I don't consider him a mystic, but a lot of people that are either analytic philosophers or Kantians consider him a mystic.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this kind of mystical, poetic imagery goes on through the ages of the world. And essentially what happens is he reads Hegel's Science of Logic, and he realizes that Hegel has kind of perfected idealism, that Hegel's Science of Logic has brought about this idea of the absolute unfolding, self-consciousness, freedom, from spirit onward to communities, etc. And he realizes there's an error here. And the error is that, one, we can never philosophize about that which we've never experienced. So we cannot philosophize about the unconscious past. It just becomes conjecture. And he sees this as a problem of what Hegel begins at the Science of Logic in the doctrine of being. Is there being or non-being? Well, if there's non-being, then there must be some element of being. And then we get to becoming. And this doctrine of being is what makes Schelling realize that his idealism is, in a sense, a negative philosophy. It's a philosophy that starts off always looking for the essence of something. But by looking for the essence, it's, in a sense, always abstracting outward or to the past. And so he considers his Ages of the World project a failure. That's why he never completes it. So he realizes that he, like Kant, is too stuck in reason. It's a limiting force to him. He's stuck into this idealism. He's stuck into this element of always tracing out the essence of something, looking out the was, he says, the whatness of things. What is this? Well, this is why this happens, etc. And he realizes the only way to get out of this is this kind of ecstasy of reason, a leaping out of reason. And so this becomes his positive philosophy phase, where he really becomes a mature philosopher, where it's not like he says he disagrees with the freedom essay. There's a lot of elements of the freedom essay and the ages that are in his late work. And I actually consider the failure of not the failure, but the kind of incompleteness of the Ages of the World that allow him to create the philosophy of revelation. He realizes that we can only ever philosophize about the moment, about, that there is a world at all, and he starts off from the very question of why is there something rather than nothing? And this is where he begins his philosophy, his positive philosophy, that being precedes potency. So he started off in his nature philosophy with with talking about nature as this unconditioned power, and then getting to the potencies. And then his objective idealism was all about how intellectual intuition can grab or grasp the essence of the interrelatedness of the world. Everything going back to essence. So everything is still ingrained in the abstract for him. And so he really states that the only way forward is ontology. And so you can see, of course, this inspiring Heidegger and many other late philosophers. So he now sees that the only true thing that philosophy can do, this positive philosophy, is figure out the question of thatness, of facticity, of, the fact that there is a world, So from that moment, from that kind of radical element of contingency, how can we know that there is a God, that there is this, that there are these processes in the world? So, and that's where he ends his positive philosophy. And so he really sees his past philosophy, and I don't mean from 1809 onward. I mean, 1809, the Freedom Essay and the Ages are kind of the middle Schelling, which form the hinge of his late philosophy. So they're still a part of this kind of radical new project, but he now moves away from idealism. He moves away from that moment, and this is why he's called into Berlin, because he's teaching in Munich, and his lecture notes had been passed around, and people had heard about this positive philosophy that was, in a sense, in contradistinction to Hegel's logic. And so he says, no, logic can't tell us anything about the world. The a priori, the innate, all of these things all relate to this kind of abstract, absolute concept. Well, what does the concept tell us about the world? Can't. We're no longer going to be talking about intuitions and concepts and content, but we're going to now be talking about how we cognize thatness, how we cognize that there is a world, that there is this kind of facticity belonging, right? It's the element of the kind of the necessity of contingency, in a sense. Like he becomes obsessed with this question and writes on it right until the end of his death, actually.
And then is his work picked up fairly quickly? Does it? I mean, often is the case with figures like Schelling, it fades away, usually sort of immediately. I mean, what's his standing like after he passes away?
Well, this metaphysical empiricism, which he calls it, affects people like William James and of course Peirce. Josiah Royce, like the pragmatist movement, affects a lot of people. The early Habermas, of course, Heidegger. It is picked up, I think, by certain thinkers. It's more so essentially there's a kind of Catholic strain of Schelling. You know, there are people like he's a cardinal now. Walter Casper picks up Schelling. Paul Tillich picks up Schelling's philosophy and philosophizes about, the middle and the late Schelling as well. So, and then there's a fade after that, after Habermas and writes his thesis on him in the 60s. And then he's seen as a kind of a rational figure, through Lukács and Engel's anti-Schelling work. So his positive philosophy is now just getting there's a lot of new research coming out on it. But there wasn't so much research on it, in the late 90s, as now there's new translations coming out. There's going to be a translation in 2026, I believe, on his entire lectures on the positive philosophy, or on the philosophy of revelation. And so it's really great. So if you want to jump into Schelling and you don't know where to start, you can read his lectures called On the History of Modern Philosophy. And he philosophizes from Descartes right up to Hegel, and he has a critique of Hegel. And that even in his grounding of positive philosophy, he does the same thing. He shows you the history of negative philosophy and positive philosophy and the split. But you still need negative philosophy and you still need positive philosophy. You need them both. Just like in his earlier work, you had nature philosophy and transcendental philosophy, and they both formed a whole. The same thing happens here. Now it's just kind of a meta philosophy in a sense.
Okay. And that's where you'd advise people to begin if they want to, with those lectures?
I think those lectures are really, really good. It's Schelling at his most clear. The grounding of positive philosophy, Schelling actually wrote it. He wrote it in his own hand. The lectures on the philosophy of revelation that we have are all from students. And There was a theologian at the time that was quite close with Hegel named Paulus, who hired students to write verbatim everything in the lectures in order to publish them and kind of make Schelling look like an idiot. And that happened. And so the philosophy of revelation that we have is essentially those lecture notes. But it's great because the Munich lectures, so on the history of modern philosophy and the grounding, which come from the Munich lectures, you get what Schelling is saying, what he's writing about. And he's philosophizing, this is what negative philosophy looks like. This is the error that happens. This is what goes on with a priori philosophy from Kant and Fichte onward. And then the problem of what Hegel does, and he thinks Hegel takes the real, so the world itself, and collapses it into the ideal in order to show the kind of unfolding of the absolute concept or the absolute idea. And of course, Hegelians will have a problem with this, but this is, of course, Schelling's critique. But yeah, so this is it's a great place to start with him, and a great kind of, it's a good place to put your anchor, and dive in.
Is there anything you'd like to add about? I'm sure you could add anything and everything, but is there anything you'd like to add about Schelling that you feel is key at this juncture?
So I like to think of it as this phase of his where he was in deep reflection, the world had, his star of oh gosh, his kind of notoriety is gone. He's no longer popular. Notoriety is the wrong word. His popularity has gone away, and he's kind of just faded off into history. And then he's rethinking at this time. I mean, he's still lecturing, but he's not publishing anything. He's, as I said, he does those 2 archaeological digs. Actually, funny, he wants to find the underworld entrance that Virgil talks about in Cumi. So I think he goes to Florence for this. Yeah, so I think this phase, he really rethinks his entire history. It's really interesting to see a philosopher, be so critical of themselves and say, okay, you know what, you got me here, that you're right. This is true. But he also says that, it doesn't downplay his past philosophy. You need that in order to get to a point. Mm-hmm. He says it's almost like a subjective decision where the philosopher decides now to start philosophizing positive philosophy. They've gone through the whole essence of looking for the essence of the things, right? Of realizing, okay, what is system? What is a philosophy? What are we looking for? Where are the concepts? And then from there now, reaching a point where we get to this question of, why is there something rather than nothing? Which, by the way, is not his authentic question. It starts off with Leibniz and then goes to Schelling and then goes to Heidegger, of course. So this is why this philosopher has enamored me, fascinated me, because there are so many sides to him and so many things to explore with him.
Mm-hmm. And you're still writing your PhD?
Unfortunately, yes, I'm still writing it.
I didn't mean it like that.
No. Actually, it's called the crisis of reason, because I'm talking about this crisis that Schelling has around 1821, where he can't complete the ages of the world. He needs a new kind of philosophy, a new kind of metaphysics, right? A metaphysical empiricism in a sense. He needs a new way of looking at the world. And it's funny that it comes through a critique of his main philosophical enemy. And now he's rethinking maybe the past errors or maybe a new outlet. So I find it really intriguing, actually.
Mm-hmm. And are you working on anything else, or,
I have. So I actually have a chapter on Burma's influence on the freedom essay, which is coming out in a journal in 2025. And then I have three actually coming out. I have another article on Schelling's transcendental philosophy, and I'm mapping out the kind of monism and his influence with Spinoza and from intellectual intuition into reason. And then a third one I'm writing on kind of what I'm talking about, this crisis of pure reason, this crisis of reason where Schelling is rethinking negative philosophy and moving into positive philosophy. Now, if you were to interview a Hegelian, they would disagree with everything I'm saying. There's no such thing as negative philosophy to them. Schelling just made it all up. So,
and we should also say you also have your podcast as well.
Yes, I do. I have this. I have this podcast called The Young Idealist, and what I wanted to do was map out the history of classical German philosophy from the 18th century onward and their influences. And by the way, I took cues from you. I really liked what your podcast, because I think what you do is you interview and have these wonderful, rich discussions about thinkers on the margins. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to rip that idea off you because you have such a wonderful project, but I wanted to talk about figures like Baumgarten and Wolff and Fichte and Schelling and all these other German thinkers. Eschmeyer, I have an episode on Eschmeyer, and I'm editing one on Marx right now as well too. So I wanted to not just do the big figures, but also talk about the minor figures, as well as the German Jews, the German Jewish philosophers, and the women of the 18th and 19th century that are, it's such a huge pivotal moment. So that's what it is. It's essentially following a hero of mine, Brian McGee. Mm-hmm. Those old videos on YouTube, where he sits down on a big comfy couch and has these discussions. And I wanted discussions like that to have, so we can listen to academics talk about these ideas in an introductory, but also intermediate way as well, too, intermediate fashion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for your podcast and the links to if the links are live, for the book chapters in the description below. But is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just want to thank you for giving me the time to, talk about Schelling and to go through his life, and hopefully I did him justice, going through all of these eras. So, and yeah, thank you so much. I'm actually a fan of your podcast. So, it's a real big honor to be on here. And yeah.
That's great. Christopher Satoor, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.